Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to see everybody here. And if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for taking the time to watch there as well. It's week 3 of Better Understanding the Bible. And in week 3, we're going to talk about the historical books. As a bit of review, week 1, we talked about an overview of the Bible as a whole and ideas like literary styles and languages and versions and all that good stuff. Last week, we talked about the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and how to look at those, how to read those, and what the story that they're telling is, and why specifically Deuteronomy ends before the Israelites enter the promised land. And that's going to be key as we pick up the historical books today. So if you haven't watched those videos yet, strongly recommend that you go back and take a look at those as well. You don't have to, but some of what I'm going to say makes a lot more sense if you've watched those. So into the historical books, we're going to dive. By way of overview, there are 12 historical books, and I sent out an email with a link to a sheet that's got them all kind of listed there. So it might be nice to have that somewhere off to the side or on a device if you have one of those, so that as I'm running through these historical books, you can kind of see where we are in the order of them. There are 12. There's Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. These compose what are called the historical books. And what they do is they tell the bulk of the history of ancient Israel. We talked about, kind of creation up until entering the promised land, but it's that point during the Exodus, really, and entering the promised land, that we start to get this feeling of Israel as a nation, as a people. And so this then stretch of books tells the story of that people living together in a specific place. And we're talking about from loosely, but somewhere between the 13th and 15th century BCE to the 5th century BCE. We're talking about almost 1,000 years of history here. So if you'll just pay attention for the next 3 to 4 hours, we'll get through this all together. It'll be great. No, it's a lot. And so I'm going to try, it's going to be a lot of skimming. We're not going to be able to get into the details of the books the way that I was able to last week, just because of the number of them. So we'll just address that right off the top. But I do want to note a couple of things about them. One, authorship. We don't really know who wrote these, much in the way that in the Torah, the tradition says that Moses wrote them, but we saw in Deuteronomy where Moses died and then there was more stuff to come. So clearly he didn't write that. Joshua specifically is traditionally thought of as written by Joshua, but he dies at some point in the book. So again, somebody else either finished this or edited it, or something else was going on here. But throughout the rest of these books, the author is never explicitly mentioned, which again doesn't necessarily impact the validity of these books or the value of these books, but it's just, you want to be upfront about that off the top, that we don't know specifically who wrote these. In terms of literary style, what you find here primarily is what I've been calling narrative history, is this way of telling history via a story, which means that we can't evaluate it the same way that we'd evaluate the biography of Abraham Lincoln that I talked about last week. You have to evaluate, you have to understand that as you're reading these books, you're reading the stories of Israel's history that are leading to a specific point, that are being told through a specific lens, that are being told with an idea in mind. And so you hold the historical details loosely, because some of those get fudged here or there, but it's for a point and for a purpose. And if you understand that, then you don't lose the value of these historical books. In Ruth and Esther specifically, those are just straight narrative. Those are just stories. They are set in a historical setting, and it fits into these historical books for those reasons. But they're really more about the story than they are about any history of Israel. And we'll touch on that when we get to the end. So I want to start with Joshua. The book of Joshua is the first in the list of these 12 books. As we said at the end of last week, that at the end of Deuteronomy, the people are poised to enter into the promised land. Now the book of Joshua tells the story of them actually entering the promised land. So they enter the promised land, and then there's the conquering of the people that are in the promised land. And this takes us back to the note about violence that we talked about in the Old Testament last week. And I want to touch on that again, because when you read in Joshua about the people entering the promised land, the text will say that everybody that was there was totally wiped out, man, woman, and child. They were all killed. And then a few chapters later down the line, they talk about how the Israelites were interacting with the people that were there before them. So there's a bit of hyperbole going on, right? You have to understand, again, the ancient Near Eastern context, that when there was military conflict, when there was a battle in the ancient Near East, the side that won believed that they won because their God was stronger than the other people's God. And so they attributed everything that they did to the strength of their God. And again, they got a little hyperbolic about it, up to and including this idea of, we wiped out all of our enemies. All of our enemies were destroyed. Nobody was left. There wasn't a blade of grass left in there. Well, obviously that's not the case. And we know that. So again, hyperbole is key, and you have to hold these things, these ideas loosely, up to and including descriptions of violence in the Old Testament. So the people enter the land, they conquer the people that are there, and then the land gets divided amongst the 12 tribes of Israel. Sort of. It actually gets divided amongst 11 tribes of Israel, because the Levites, that particular tribe, remember, they were the priestly class. They were the descendants of Aaron, the brothers of Moses, and they didn't get a parcel of land. Instead, they were servants. And so they worked at, within all the other tribes and were supported by all the other tribes. Land was everything. When people were wealthy in the ancient Near East, they were ancient because they had a lot of land. Land was huge. But in this case, when you were going to be serving God directly as the priestly class, you didn't get land, you got supported by everybody else because you were supporting them in helping maintain that relationship with God. So the land was divided amongst 11 tribes, and then the Levites served primarily amongst the tribe of Judah, because that's where Jerusalem was, but throughout the rest of the land of Israel as well. One last thing about Joshua is that it also lays out the rules for interacting with other nations around them. And that's going to be very important as we go forward here, because Israelites tend to fail in terms of following those particular rules. We talked about all the laws in the Torah, and that the bulk of the 613 laws in the Old Testament could be found there, but there are rules and laws that come after that. And we see some of those here in Joshua, especially when it comes to interacting with other peoples. Remember, the whole point of Leviticus was the holiness idea, right? Was this idea of being set apart as a people, was this idea of behaving in a different way so that other people would notice and be drawn to it and understand and try to understand more about the God that dictated this way of going. So part of that is other nations around them interacted with each other in a certain way. And God has now asked Israel, no, the way that you're going to interact with these folks is going to be different, and set a different kind of example. And that gets laid out towards the end of Joshua. That's the book of Joshua, which, as I hinted earlier, ends with his death. And what's interesting is that when Moses died, Joshua was named the leader of the people. When Joshua dies, there isn't a leader named. And whether that just wasn't somebody there, or if it was the ethos of God's going to be in charge now. God's going to be our king. God's going to be our leader. We're going to look to God. We don't need necessarily a human leader. However it was, when we get into the book of Judges, which is the next book, there is no one singular leader going into that book. In fact, in the book of Judges, you see this line repeated a bunch of times, that was a time that there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes. You see that repeated throughout that book. And as you might imagine, that sort of leadership model didn't go well for the people of Israel. And that leadership model not going well is the story of the book of Judges. So there were 12 judges in total over the course of the history told in the book of Judges. And there's a pattern that gets established. We talked about that with the Exodus a little bit, and even in Genesis, that there's this pattern in the Bible of God trying to lead people screwing that up, and God coming alongside them to say, okay, not what I intended. Here's how we're going to bring good out of it. And then we're going to try and get back on track here. And that pattern happens over and over and over and over again. And you see it very much so here in the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, that looks like people who are without a earthly leader drifting away from the path that God has laid out before them. Bad things start to happen. They start to violate those rules about interacting with other people, with other nations, start worshiping other gods, doing things like that, building temples and altars to other gods. And bad things start to happen. Those other nations start to dominate them. Those other nations start to oppress them. And when that happens, the people cry out to God for help. Bad things are happening. People are crying out. God hears their cries, and God raises up a judge, a leader, to deal with a particular situation. That judge deals with whatever earthly situation that is, helps lead the nation back on track towards the path that God had laid out. And then things go well for about 40 years. Or at least that's the number. I could get into a whole sideshow about the symbolic nature of numbers in the Old Testament, but there's a reason that it was 40 years in the wilderness as people were wandering, and that 40 years was the period of time that things seemed to be pretty peaceful. But as you go through those decades, people start to drift again. And then we start the pattern over again. People drift away. They start doing bad things. The outsiders come in and start to dominate and oppress, and God has to raise up another judge. This happens 12 times over the course of the book of Judges. And that's really the pattern that's there. The story, of course, of Samson is the one that people are most familiar with, but there are 12 different judges, including Deborah, who's the lone female judge. and a great story of a female leader in the Old Testament. But it's that pattern that keeps happening over and over and over again. So we've had the people gone into the promised land. That's Joshua. And then while they're in there, how are they behaving? That's Judges. And then we get to Ruth. And I'm going to put a pin in Ruth. We're going to come back to Ruth at the end, because as I said earlier, Ruth isn't necessarily about the history. Ruth is about the story. That story is set in the history of Judges, which is why that book is where it is. But it's not so much concerned with the history of the people, but more of a story about love and relationship. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But on a historical timeline, we go essentially from that era of Judges into the era of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now you'll notice there's 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. This isn't like in the New Testament where you have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, or 1st Corinthians and 2nd Corinthians as separate entities. The story in Samuel, the story in Kings, the story in Chronicles is one contiguous story. But you have to remember these writings were put on scrolls back in the day, and these are really long stories. So if you have a really long story on a scroll, you end up with a really big scroll. And so the way that they kept it where it was easy to carry these scrolls around is to divide them into 2 different scrolls. Now, when you put stories into a book, into a codex, that becomes not as much of a problem, right? I mean, it's easier to handle, which is why the books were invented. But traditionally, these have all been separated into 2 separate scrolls, and that's why when you get into book form, they remain 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. So that's just one note. So I'm going to talk about 1st and 2nd kind of as one entity. I'll talk about Samuel, I'll talk about Kings, and I'll talk about Chronicles. We're going to start with Samuel. So after the years of all the judges, the people decide, hey, instead of waiting until we're in trouble for there to be a leader raised up, why don't we just do what everybody else around us does and have a leader there all the time? And we'll call it a king. Wouldn't that be great? And the prophet Samuel, who the book is named after, comes along and says, hold on. Remember, God's our king. The whole point here is to be holy, is to be separate. God is our king. We don't need an earthly king. Earthly kings tend to be bad people, as we see from all the people around us. Let's not do that. The people are like, no, we want a king. We want a king. We want a king. And so there comes a point where God and Samuel are together in prayer, and God says, Samuel, don't worry. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. So it's okay. You and I together, we'll figure out who should be king. We'll give them what they want. We'll try to bring good out of this mistake, because in God's mind, this is a mistake. This is not the plan he had for the people of Israel. But God is always able to bring good out of problematic decisions by human beings. So we're going to try and bring good out of this, and we'll try and get them back on track. It's that pattern playing out again. So God tells Samuel it's okay. We're going to find a king, and they find King Saul. King Saul is the first king of all of Israel. And like you see so often, Saul starts out as a really good guy. He's smart, he's wise, he's popular, people love him. This is why he's going to make us great king. But like a lot of human beings that receive a lot of power over a lot of people, it's a situation where it can corrupt them, and it does corrupt Saul. Saul goes from being a very good king to being quite a lousy king, and picking fights with countries that he shouldn't, and killing people that he shouldn't, and dominating people that he shouldn't. And there comes a point where Samuel and God are again in prayer, and it's clear that Saul is not going to be a good king for Israel. God says, that's okay. I have plan B. There's this kid who's this little shepherd boy. He's the son of Jesse. Go out and find him. We're going to make him king. And of course, that's King David. King David being the most famous of all the Israelite kings. And so the story of David and Goliath, and the story of David's conflict with Saul and his friendship with Saul's son, Jonathan, and a lot of the stories that people are loosely familiar with, you can find all of those in 1st and 2nd Samuel, as David comes to power and David becomes king. And through David's reign, Israel finds peace. Israel finds an expansion of their borders, and Israel finds a unity that's going to be tested very, very soon. That's the reign of King David. We don't go all the way to the end of the reign of King David. The end of that reign is the story told in 1st and 2nd Kings. We'll get to that in a minute. But that's essentially the through line here of the 1st and 2nd Samuel books. We've gone from the people entering the promised land through the period of judges. Now we're into the era where there's going to be kings, and the most famous and most successful of all those kings is King David. And that gets us to the end of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And we'll take a breath there, because that's a lot that I just blew through, but there's a lot more to come. Anybody have any questions or thoughts or anything that jumps out at them at this point? All right. So we'll go on to 1st and 2nd Kings. The start of 1st Kings is the end of David's reign. His life's coming to an end. He's decided that God really needs a temple. That if you remember, throughout the travels of the Exodus, God followed with the people either as a pillar of flame and cloud or in the tabernacle, which was just a tent that was set up wherever the Israelites happened to camp. That was where God was with them on earth. David decides, now that we've sort of settled in this place, now that we're sort of settled down, we need a permanent structure. And of course, because it's for God, it's got to be a glorious structure. God tells David, no, I don't need a tent. Look, I've been in a tent for however many years here. It's fine. We're good. We don't need to do that. No. We have to have a temple. We have to have a temple. Again, God trying to lead people, the people screwing it up. And God comes along and says, okay, here's the deal. We can have a temple if you're going to insist on it. You're not going to build it. Your son's going to build it. So we're going to take this in a different direction. That son, of course, was King Solomon. King Solomon's the one that got to build the temple. King Solomon's the one who most of the Proverbs are attributed to. King Solomon, known for his wisdom. The very first thing when God comes to Solomon and says, what do you want to make your reign the best it can be? Solomon prays for wisdom. Doesn't pray for riches, doesn't pray for military power, but prays for wisdom. Solomon starts as a very good king. But as we see again, human beings given a lot of power tend to be corrupted. And by the end of Solomon's reign, things are not going well at all. In fact, they're going so badly by the end of it that when his son takes over, Rehoboam, the nation of Israel splits into two different nations. So Rehoboam is Solomon's son. He takes over. The northern tribes send representatives down to him and say, hey, your dad was being kind of harsh with us. He was taxing us a lot. He was asking us for a lot of stuff that he didn't ask the tribe of Judah, which is where Jerusalem is in the south. He wasn't asking them to do the same things he's asking us. Can we kind of restart the relationship here? Can we get on better footings with each other? And Rehoboam goes and consults his dad's advisors. And those advisors tell him, yeah, actually, these folks are right. Your dad was kind of harsh. Maybe we need to kind of chill it out a little bit here and not be so harsh to them. Then Rehoboam goes and talks to his buddies, the teens, the young guys that he's grown up with. And they all tell him, forget that noise. If they're complaining, make it even more harsh on them. You're the king. You're in charge. They have to do what you say. And if they're not liking what you're doing, make it even worse. And unfortunately, that's the advice that Rehoboam listens to. And that leads to the two nations. So we see a schism where these northern tribes get together and say, we're our own nation now. And that's usually in the Bible referred to as Israel. And then the southern kingdom becomes the kingdom of Judah, which contains the city of Jerusalem, which is where the temple is and the holiest sites in Judaism are. The other name you'll hear for that northern kingdom is Ephraim, and that's just one of the tribes that was located there as well. The important thing to know about that northern kingdom is that its capital was a city called Samaria. And that should ring a bell. Because when you have the parable of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament, Jesus is telling a story there about who is your neighbor. And he picks the most unlikely person to be thought of positively as being the example of who your neighbor really is. So the reason that it's unlikely is because when this split happens, this northern kingdom really starts following the traditions and following the gods of other areas around them. And the Jews in the south decide that they're the real Jews and that everybody in the north is something other than they are. And that's the split. And so not only are you not really Jewish, but you're not Jewish in the most corrupt, despicable way. And so Jews in the south really didn't like folks to the north. And that's why that parable is something that when we read it today without knowing that history, we don't get the same reaction. If you were a Jew in Jesus's time and you heard him praising a Samaritan, that would be the weirdest thing you could possibly think of. Because of course, those are all lousy people. They've been lousy people all throughout this whole history, all the way back to this story in 1 Kings. We've read about how terrible they are this whole time and all the things that they did wrong. How can I possibly treat that person with love, treat that person with favor, treat that person with mercy and grace? It's this kind of understanding of the history that becomes so important to really getting at that parable and how deep it really is. So that's important, that capital city of the northern tribe is Samaria. Unfortunately, as I said, you have this list of all of the kings, right? Now you go into the list of all the northern kings and the list of southern kings, and it kind of goes back and forth. So this king in the north died, this new king took over, Then this king in the south died and the new king took over. And it's just back and forth for the rest of the stretch. There's about 20 northern kings that are described. All of them are described as lousy kings. Not a one of them was redeemable in the eyes of God. But if you think that that's just bias, there were about, I think, 18 in the south, and only 6 of them were looked at as worthy of God and good in the eyes of God. So you have the story of a lot of lousy kings and a lot of things that they did wrong. And it becomes somewhat repetitive, I will grant you. But it's interesting in that if you were writing the Bible from a specific bias, if you were writing these stories to say, hey, we in the South are great and these folks in the North are all horrible, well, you got about half right, but you did a lousy job of saying that those folks in the South were great because only 6 of those 18 kings were worth a darn. So, point being that there's a lot of history there that can get a little bit redundant, but the story is that folks in these times and areas were not following the path that God had laid out in front of them, and bad things were happening. In the north, you have a nearby kingdom called Assyria, and the Assyrians come and destroy the northern capital and take people into slavery and disperse them out of that northern kingdom and into exile, and they never return. That's the end of the history of the north. In the south, in that Judah, where Jerusalem is and the Davidic kings were, the Assyrians then come and try to take over the south. They're not able to do so. God steps in. There's a good king. Things go okay. And then there's a series of bad kings and things aren't going okay. And you have the kingdom of Babylon that comes along and eventually takes over the south and destroys the south, destroys the temple in Jerusalem, takes the Jerusalem citizens as slaves. And that's what's known as the Babylonian exile, which is in the middle of the 5th century BCE. So we started with people entering into the promised land. That's sometime in like the 13th, 14th century BC. Now we're in this 5th century BC with the exile. That's a lot of history. And they sort of, again, jump in spots and go kind of all over the place. The other thing you're going to find in Kings, by the way, is the start of the prophets rising up. The stories of Elijah and Elisha, who were northern prophets, who were prophets trying to tell northern kings, hey, y'all are doing this wrong. You're not following God's path, and bad things are going to happen if we keep doing this. And guess what? They're right. The northern kings don't listen, but they're right. And that leads to the end of the northern kingdom. And eventually this exile, this Babylonian exile that we talk about so much in the southern kingdom. That's the end of 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, when we get to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, if you've read any of 1st and 2nd Chronicles before, you will notice, especially if you're reading straight through, that there's a whole lot of these stories. Didn't I just read these? Wait a minute, what's going on? Why am I reading a repeat of these stories? And that's why I asked you to watch the 1st and 2nd Chronicles video, because they do a really good job in those videos of explaining why these are being repeated, why these stories are being repeated. And this goes back to our discussion of historical narrative. When we're writing stories, we're writing history in stories rather than in just facts and quotations and times and dates. You're writing with a thought in mind. And what 1st Chronicles is the idea of summarizing the history that you see in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, but doing so in a way that's pointing towards a messianic figure. This is the start of where we're talking about the things that come up a lot in the prophets, especially Isaiah. But this messianic figure, this history is all leading us towards a goal of this Messiah. Of course, we in Christianity believe that Messiah to be found in Jesus, and that's the entirety of the New Testament. But this is where that pointing towards the Messiah really, really gets into it really gets serious, is in the story of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So what you'll also notice is that some of the stories of King David, say the story about Bathsheba and some of the other bad things that he did, those finally get left out of Chronicles. They're not there, because this Davidic king, the Messiah, is supposed to be a David-like king, and we can't have a Messiah that does the bad things that the King David did. So that's another interesting little piece of it. And it's why, again, you want to hold all of these historical truths very, very loosely, because this is a story being told with a purpose, and that doesn't invalidate the value of the story. It just means we have to understand what's being told and why we're being told it in this bigger framework. Okay? All right. We will go back on mute here and we will continue. We're going to continue with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And you'll see on that sheet that I sent you that those two are paired together. They are two separate books, but they're paired together because they tell essentially the same kind of historical story. This is the story of the Babylonian exile and the return from that exile. Ezra is a scribe who returned to Jerusalem from exile in Babylon, with the Torah. He was the first guy to walk into Jerusalem with the official Torah. Here's the first 5 books, the laws of Moses. This is our symbolic return as a people to Jerusalem. Nehemiah was a royal cupbearer in the Persian kingdom. Babylon conquers the southern kingdom, takes people out into exile for 50 years. Then the Persians conquer the Babylonians and send all the Jews home because they don't really want to be bothered with them. So Nehemiah is a cupbearer in the royal court of Persia, but has not forgotten his Jewish heritage, has not forgotten his people, has not forgotten that he wants to be somebody that follows God. And so when he hears how bad things are in Jerusalem, he prays to God, what can I do? And God instructs him to go to the king and ask the king if the king will provide money for materials to help go, and then send Nehemiah back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls around the city of Jerusalem. So Nehemiah, it's funny, it was a book that we studied in a leadership class in seminary. And it was very much about his leadership skills and how he went about going back and helping rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And so you get a lot of, modern leadership books. There's a whole section of my bookshelf over here that's leadership books. But there's leadership qualities in the Bible, and that was found a lot in the story of Nehemiah. And so this class wanted to take the story of Nehemiah and turn it into almost a one-on-one on how to be a leader, and look what he did here and how he built coalitions over here and how he participated in certain situations in over here, and so on and so forth. And we'll get to your question in 1 second, Sherry. But the truth is that this is the story in Ezra and Nehemiah of the people of Israel coming back home and reestablishing their identity as the people of God. So all of this rebuilding of the city wall and rebuilding of the temple and so on and so forth is true in a historical sense to a degree, but it's also very much metaphorical in that this pattern of God trying to lead the people screwing up, God coming along and saying, no, we can have good from this, and now we're going to try and get you back on track, is very much found here as well. Now, this is them coming back. This is God trying to get them back on track. We've screwed up. We've not followed God's plan. It led to us being dominated by the Babylonians and dispersed out into the Babylonian Empire. And now we're going to come back and try and rebuild our lives, rebuild our city, rebuild our identity as people of God. So there's both a historical and a metaphorical nature to both of these two books. Now, I mentioned earlier we were putting a pin in the book of Ruth because that came after Judges, but wasn't really necessarily telling history. It was telling a story. The book of Ruth is great. If you only read the first chapter, which is what I assigned, that's fine. I strongly encourage you to go back and read the other 3. It's only a 4-chapter book. It's a fairly short story. You can knock it out in about a half hour. And what's brilliant about it is, well, first of all, the fact that it's a story mainly centers around 2 women, Ruth and Naomi are the 2 central characters in the story. And to think about the patriarchal nature of that society, and that any sort of idea or theology would be trying to be communicated through a story about the relationship with 2 women, is mind-boggling in that particular context, in that particular time. But what it shows to me, and this is now my opinion, so take this for what it's worth, is the work of the Spirit. We talked about in the first week that I do believe the Bible to be inspired, but I also believe that there's a whole lot of humanity in it. But if you were writing this purely without any spiritual guidance whatsoever, if you were writing it purely as human beings in that time, in that place, you wouldn't write a story where the central characters were 2 women. You just wouldn't. And so those stories of women, especially in the Old Testament that come through, are hugely important because to me, they demonstrate the Spirit's influence. So you have the book of Ruth, which is, again, a story of love. It's a story of relationship, and it's a story about how those 2 things can lead you back to God. Ruth and Naomi find themselves in horrible circumstances and try to come back home. And it's in that coming back home that their bond is forged, and they bond with the people, the Jewish folks back at home, and end up rebonding themselves with God, when Ruth especially has plenty of reasons to be mad at God. It's a very thumbnail version of that story. But again, I strongly encourage people to go back and read it. That story is, again, rooted in the time of the Judges, which is why it appears where it is. But it's sort of an interlude. It's a story about people's relationship with each other and people's relationship with God, and how those 2 things are connected in the midst of all of this history. Esther also is more of a story than it is necessarily history. It takes place, the story of Esther takes place after the exile. The thing to understand about the Babylonian exile is when you have all these people separated out all over the Babylonian Empire, and they're gone for almost 50 years. There are some of them that left Judah and Jerusalem as very, very young children and now have spent the bulk of their lives not in that place. So when the time comes and people can return, there's plenty of people that want to go back. But there's also going to be folks there that are like, my entire life is here. Everything I've known is here. Why do I want to go back there? I'm free. I'm not a slave anymore, and that's good. But if I'm going to build a life, I'm going to build a life here where this is the only place I've really known for the bulk of my life. The Jews that stayed from coming or remained and didn't come back home, there's a term called the diaspora that you'll hear at times. And that's the Jews that are spread out throughout, not in the Holy Land. So that's the setting of this story of Esther. It takes place actually in the Persian Empire. It also explains the Jewish festival of Purim, which is a holiday that occurred fairly recently. A friend of mine who I work with who's Jewish said you can basically explain Purim like you can explain most Jewish holidays, which is they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. That's basically the Jewish festivals. That's how she described it. That's not mine, that's hers. But that's really what's going on in Purim. The story of Esther is the story of how Jews that were living in Persia could have been destroyed by an official in the Persian Empire. He tried to destroy them. God steps in, God acts, the queen Esther acts and saves her people. Again, it's a female saving the people that were the Jewish people that were in Persia at the time. The interesting part about the book of Esther, and this is really the thing to get from this, is that God's name is never mentioned once in the entire book. I think it's an 11-chapter book. You never find God's name or God directly addressed anywhere in the book. And God's all over the book, but behind the scenes. You remember those pictures where when you looked at it, it just looked like visual static, but if you changed your focus range, suddenly there was a sailboat in the picture. You know what I'm talking about? This is that. This is that kind of what's called a hermeneutic, which is just a way of interpreting. That when you look at this story, God's there in the background and God's clearly acting. It's just never directly described. You have to look for God in the margins. You have to look for God in the spaces between paragraphs. That's what, and this author is doing that very deliberately. This is clearly a book where God acts. It's just never explicitly told to you. You see it behind the scenes. You see it implicitly. What's interesting about that is if you take that idea, that interpretive lens, if you take that hermeneutic is the fancy seminary term, and you go to other books in the Bible, Old and New Testament, and look at it in that way, a lot of things that are problematic, a lot of the ways that God is described that you're like, that doesn't sound like the God that I follow, become less problematic because you see this idea of God working behind the scenes saying, okay, if you need to describe me that way, I didn't exactly tell you to kill all those people, but if you need to describe me that way, because that's how you understand God's relationship with people in that time, in that place, I want to work with you. I want to work through you. And if you need to describe me that way, okay, I'm going to let you describe me that way. And when we look for God behind the scenes like that, moving behind the text, moving behind the story, inspiring, but not overwhelming, right? God doesn't take over people's brains and make them write word for word what he wants them to write. He creates people who are going to come along and write these stories and have the personality and the intelligence and the skill to write these stories. He comes alongside them and inspires them towards writing in the fashion that he desires without just lobotomizing them, taking over their brain and making them write like robots. And if you understand that about the book of Esther, you can, like I said, take that and apply it to all kinds of different books of the Bible and find all kinds of things that didn't see before in terms of how God's acting, how God's behaving, and how God's inspiring. Whew. Those are the 12 books. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. For those of you watching on YouTube, thanks for being with us. And we're going to move on to the question and answer period of time.